Emeritus Associate Professor from UCT, but I was previously also at Rhodes University, at Pretoria University and at Wits. So I've kind of done the rounds in South African universities. In fact, I previously worked here at UCT for the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. And now, in fact, I'm working for the Institutional Planning Division. So quality assurance is what I do at the moment, but otherwise I'm a consultant, learning designer and researcher in higher education. When you think about how learning takes place, it's not one size fits all, because it depends on what you're trying to learn in terms of how you might learn it best. And it's not the same for everybody. Some people have just natural abilities to learn from reading, or people want demonstrations. It's much more difficult to actually make a generalization for how everybody learns. So learning for me is around using the theories that we have to help connect with how a student might learn a particular thing at a particular time in their learning program or their learning journey. I think the important part is that we don't necessarily take our students' perspective into account often enough. We just assume that when students come to university, they're sort of ex-student. We don't always, I mean, I know some people do, but we don't always bother to have any kind of pre-course assessment or pre-course questionnaire where we actually ask people how would they learn something best, to get a better idea of how the different students are learning things in different ways. And then also bearing in mind, if they're a first year, they might want to learn things in a slightly different way to what they would if they were a postgrad student. So I think that's the important part there, is getting to understand a little bit more about what the students themselves say about their learning, rather than having the lecturer-imposed learning activity, which is probably reflecting the lecturer's own idea of what works for them. When I'm thinking about learning design, I actually start not with learning, but with the curriculum, and particularly how that curriculum was deliberated with people who have an interest in the course. So it may even be people in the industry, but certainly colleagues and also the students. So it's difficult for first year students to know what they want, but the further up you go, the more likely it is that you would have deliberated that curriculum with them. And then I think a better match, and that's the role of the learning designer, between what are we trying to help students learn and how might they learn that best, and particularly giving them options in how to do that. So once I have understood their learning, then I would look at, if that's the way they learn something, how could I as the lecturer then best teach them, or at least facilitate their learning? And then only after that make some decisions around methods and different activities, because otherwise you're inclined to start the process with how is this convenient for me to teach? And sometimes it isn't necessarily the most convenient way if that's the way the student wants to learn. So, and then after that, look at the assessment. And I always try to twin assessment with feedback, because we often think about assessment and we don't think how that actually closes the loop. And then ultimately to have a sense of the evaluation of the whole course. So I think that's where the learning designer has got the main elements. And then of course the tricky parts are how they use the various technologies to help for each of the stages, whether you are deliberating the curriculum, looking at how students might use technology in their learning, how lecturers might use technology in their presentations or their facilitation, and then likewise different ways of assessing, different ways of evaluating. And then the last part of this whole mix is in fact the communication, because we can have this beautifully designed course, but unless we communicate exactly what we're expecting from the students at the right time, no matter how much you try to get the design to do the work, ultimately it's the communication that really matters. And I think that's part of the role of the university lecturer, is to help students attain that meta level thinking, because ultimately that's our job, is to be able to teach a student to think about their own learning, to become reflexive in that way. And even if we start with small ways in asking questions about how they might learn something best, could they have learned this in a slightly different way, what would have helped, we ask that more regularly throughout their university career. That will be one small way in which we can help them build on their own learning. Because, I mean, lucky we have them here for 3 years or 4 years, and then they're out on their own. And we know the pace of development at the moment, you've got to be learning all the time. So I think of all the things the university lecturer needs to do is to help students become masters of their own learning. Well, you know, one of the challenges we've had in the last couple of years has just been this information explosion. And there's just been so much that actually a little human being on their own just cannot actually engage with that amount of information. And so we're missing things. We're missing articles people have written because we perhaps aren't putting in the right keywords, or we're just not able to do as much as a human being with all this vast information that we have available to us. So I'm excited that we've actually got a tool that can help augment our work. I'm not looking at replacing, I'm looking at augmenting and being able to check things immediately. So I think that's what is really exciting, that you can actually do more in-depth and rigorous work with AI than without it. So one of the things that AI has been helpful for me is checking up on things immediately. So, I mean, it's literally like having the Encyclopedia Britannica available to you to ask any question, and then for the book to talk back to you and say, well, have you thought about this or that? And I think sometimes, particularly, for example, and I've been like doing proofreading, sometimes the sentences that I have thought were my best, when they have been scrutinized by an AI, actually turn out not to be so. And I can see after the AI's finished a great deal of improvement just in that particular aspect. But what I like the most is that you can ask deeper and deeper questions. So the more specific you can get, and that's almost impossible to do if you're running around a book-based library, trying to find information and combining things together, coming up with a different term, a different word, and then being able to search on that and having options to have that paraphrased for you. Some of the AIs even offer you columns that you can fill in, not fill in, that will fill it in for you if you give it the prompt. So for example, one of the AIs I was using gave me the opportunity to put in what theories do these papers use. And it was absolutely accurate in terms of after I'd alerted which papers I was looking for, so that I could see, okay, well, this one's going to work or that one isn't. And it gave you options to have a few extra columns. So yeah, that's made it really powerful. You've got like a thinking assistant. It is a research assistant. And I think if you think about this AI as augmenting your process, then I think it's fine. I think the minute you think it's going to do its work, can do your work for you, then you're in trouble, because it's only going to do as much as you prompt it in that respect. And it's not necessarily going to think of everything for a big project. So a short little 200-word piece, yeah, it'll do that pretty easily. but actually doing a sustained piece of work. You need it as a companion beside you to test out ideas, to test out hypotheses as you're going along, and see who else has written about this. So one particular thing that's also helpful is that you ask the AIs to identify the research questions asked in papers, because that's one of the most tricky things for lecturers and students to work out, is exactly what is the research question being asked here. And if you know you've got a corpus of articles around the topic, and you can get a machine to go and check out all the research questions or to check out the theories, it makes it so much easier. And especially framing research questions. Sometimes we just don't have the grammar right, and giving an idea to an AI and it comes up with a whole bunch of alternatives for you to consider can be extremely helpful in a process, in augmenting that process along the way. So first of all, it's sort of AI in general, is that it still throws up complete inaccuracies. I think they call them hallucinations. And in fact, I had one just about 2 weeks ago when I asked it to look at a particular topic of blended learning and accessibility. And it wrote a really good piece for me and provided full references. And I looked at the references like I would. You always got to check those. I thought, this is amazing. But how come I've missed these? Because I've been working in this area on a project for a while and I don't recall any of these. Well, I went and checked and not one of them was actually a real article. And this is only a few weeks ago. So it does happen. I won't mention the AI because maybe it'll improve in 2 weeks' time, but certainly you've got to be careful about the accuracy. So the role of the researcher is pretty much more like a detective. Okay, so that's the one thing. The other thing is we're not entirely sure about how it's coming up with its conclusions. So the issues of transparency are not always that clear. The other thing is bias. So the AIs are drawing on the corpus of work it currently has available. And I think if there are built-in biases, whether it be language or particular cultural perspectives, those are all going to come out in the AI as well. And I think perhaps for our context in South Africa, I think that one of the biggest issues for me is the economic one, which is that not everybody is going to be able to afford the more bells and whistles AI. So they will be limited to some of the ordinary general AIs, which can do some work for you, but really not enough. And then it's going to become an issue of money. And then the know-nots and the have-nots are going to combine, and I feel that is absolutely dangerous. And it's so against the social justice imperative that we have in general society. For students in particular, I'm worried they think it's going to do their work for them and that they're going to try and outsource some of their thinking to it. But I suspect that it'll just take a little while for us to learn to work with AIs, because my sense is they're going nowhere. They're part of the ecosystem now, and I think the work that we do with them is going to become increasingly more difficult, and without an assistant we wouldn't be able to do that kind of work. So I suspect that for our students, coming to that realization sooner rather than later would be a desire of mine, so that they don't think it's going to do the work for them. So I think that is our biggest challenge, is AI novices, when they don't know enough to know what an answer might be, what is plausible. I think AI is going to come into the schools as well. So it's like, it was like when we had a Google search engine. we had to learn about the limits of a Google search engine. I think the same thing with AI. We're going to have to learn about it. So I think these first couple of years with students coming in as novices from school, we still might have to do a lot of support work. So I think one of the things that does help, and I have used already, is to encourage students to use the same prompt but in a range of AIs, and then to literally do a comparison between them and then start asking questions about what each AI was focusing on and where the tensions are, where some of the overlaps seem to be, as a way to try and build the criticality around what responses are given by the AI. It's not going to be an easy process because really AI in the hands of a more sophisticated learner are probably best. But then in terms of kind of rephrasing sentences for somebody who's a second language speaker, where they write a sentence that they want to write, but it's not quite right. The AI can help with that even if you're a first year or even if you're at school. The question is if the student will eventually pick up enough of the underlying structure of the language to be able to be producing reasonable sentences by themselves without having practice at grammar. I don't know, or maybe that's just not going to be something we'll have to bother about anymore, like having calculators now rather than having just doing maths in your head. I don't know. I mean, that I think time will tell. But I do think that there is an extreme challenge in terms of identifying what is a plausible answer by novices. Also, what is a concern as well is that we don't actually entirely know what they're doing with all the data that we're feeding back. Because obviously, in order for us to have access to their data, they are incorporating our data. And in fact, some of the text that you have to agree to in order to actually be part of or to use this AI kind of feels like you're giving access to everything. So it is a bit worrying. Those ones that you're already accessing via Google make it easier to just log in the same way, but that does mean that data is being collected behind the scenes. Yeah, I think the comment about this conversation we're having now on the 23rd of April in 2024 is moot because honestly, 2 weeks ago, Meta wouldn't have released its AI. And now we've got another huge one to add to the basket of your generative AIs, sort of general purpose AIs. And I think perhaps helping people get to know what the affordances are of the general AIs. So for example, you can't not start with ChatGPT. But for example, I'm now using Perplexity as my kind of main start. But I will use Bing, I will use Meta. Meta I'm still exploring. Obviously I haven't had too much time, but I have been exploring that as well. And they're really helpful for the kind of general work. I think what we'll need to learn about, because some of them are already there, others are developing as we're speaking, are the specialist AI for research, AIs for research. So I think those, so for example, there are products that actually help you, or AIs that actually help you think about ideas and brainstorming, and then those that actually help you with not just help you with identifying literature, and once you've got your literature to help paraphrase, and once you've got that paraphrase to start looking at deeper themes. I think there are, and some of them are extending the range. So perhaps there's products like Elicit, that does a whole range of things now. Some things like Ask Your PDF, which is incredible for actually having questions asked of you and you can ask. So it works both ways. It's like a conversation around a paper you've uploaded. It's very specific. Right now it only does kind of one or two things, but it's really helpful. And I think the challenge is for us is to keep up with all these developments so that we can better match the place in the research cycle that we are and what tool we need at what period in that research cycle we are. Because I think that's going to be the challenge. And the area that I was hoping AI was going to help with sort of at a flick of a switch was cleaning of data. Well, I'm afraid that has not worked out so far. You know, when people ask a question around time, like how long does it take you to get to university, and then they leave it as an open-ended question, and you get these questions that say 20 minutes, 10 minutes, also allows for, well, between about 10 to 15 minutes, depending on the traffic. And the AIs at the moment that we have still can't deal with that level of complexity. I'm sure they will. But I think for repetitive tasks like that, we'll be able to get to better answers quicker. So, for example, running a pre-course survey, when you've got an assistant in the form of an AI to help you analyze the data and provide really easy to understand responses so that you can share that with the class literally, if not the same day, the next day, so that there's a much closing the loop between getting information and analyzing it. I think that's going to be really helpful. It's not as good as it could be. But there are some, so Formula AI has been helpful in doing some of the analysis work on data for me. I've been working with that quite a bit. And then primarily looking at proofreading. That's been the area that I've used AI the most. I know people think with a name like I have that I would be English speaking, and in fact I am, but I went to an Afrikaans primary school. So when I finally went to high school, English was kind of a second language to me. So I've always been a little insecure about my English grammar. And so this proofreading tool for me has been absolutely amazing, because that's one thing it really knows well compared to the general person, is its grammar. I haven't used as much of it in terms of prompting ideas. I have done a little, but if you use AI enough, you'll eventually realize that it starts to sound the same. It's got a formula around it, and it just loses its soul. It's just your voice, your own voice just disappears into that. So that's the part that I have used the least. But where I have really used it is when I'm unsure about an area and I'm exploring something new. I will put my basic ideas into AI and use it as a kind of a starting point. But and although it will give me a few references, I find that actually Google Scholar is still doing a lot of the work. There are other ones coming up now, like Semantic Scholar, which has been around for a while, just improving the service. I think when you can use those tools for specific purposes, I think that's when you're probably going to get the most out of it. So there's SciSpace, SciSummary, Research Rabbit. They've all got their benefits. The one thing that concerns me enormously, especially with the particular AI tools built for research, is that you can have so much free and then you have to start to purchase. And I think that's really worrying for students. It's fine for big research companies, but it's not good for students. That is a bother to me. And some of the other ones that I have been exploring, and some of these I've been exploring not necessarily using for my own work, but for writing. There are quite a couple, but the one that, quite a few I should say, but the one that I really enjoyed using was Jenny.ai for writing. And I think if I needed some writing with a few more prompts, I think that's the way I'd go. So yeah, and then in terms of the part that I thought AI would do something different or something better is in reference management. But at the moment, it seems like they're still building on the existing ones. So like EndNote and Zotero, Mendeley to some extent. It still seems like they are using those. But I'm assuming that that's going to improve, because I think if we think about anything in our research process where something is repetitive, it must be in the referencing area. And I mean, it does have the articles, by and large, if they're online, it's got them. And then often if it's a book, they've got the details. Sometimes not all the book chapters, but I think that's increasingly improving. So I would expect some development in that area. So I'm thinking really what students would need to bear in mind, and lecturers perhaps to help them with, is to use a particular tool at the particular time in that research process. So for example, using a brainstorming, concept mapping, mind mapping type of tool right at the beginning to kind of map the ideas, and then compare it to some of the mind mapping tools like idea.com, idea.ai, which actually create little maps for you, which I think would be really helpful. And then to start moving on to, so if that's your general idea, how are you going to get alerted to these articles? So by and large, it would seem for now that just your ordinary Google alert is still the main tool that's being used, despite the fact that it's not a generative AI. It's still helpful in that whole research process. And then again, whether you're using SciSummary, Semantic Scholar for looking at articles, and then when you're wanting summaries of them, AI such as Ask Your PDF right now is my all-time favorite for now, because it's doing the work I needed to do when I know which articles that I want. In terms of analysis, I mentioned the formula.ai that I have found so helpful for now. And then later on, when you're starting the writing and the proofreading, I think that's probably where we will see more of the AIs come in. I would just recommend that people use the one that's helping prompt rather than helping them to write the entire thing. Proofreading rather than writing. And then finally looking at the referencing system. We may even find there's going to be developments around holding the whole research process together, a bit like the sort of online lab notes, lab reports. We might find some development around sort of research notebooks where it's kind of holding your whole research project together. That will probably come. The only thing is, the more sophisticated these tools become, the more expensive they are to maintain with the R&D that needs to go into them, and therefore they're going to be more expensive for the user. So perhaps universities are going to have to start thinking through how they support their research students by opting into one of these, at least for a certain period of time, because otherwise they are not going to have the same access and won't have the same privilege as students who can afford to access those particular AIs. I think my key thing, and maybe this is a tip or a trick at the same time, and that is to think about the relationship between the concepts that you're looking for. Because it's not so, for example, if I say blended learning and accessibility, those are two sort of fields of interest. What the AI doesn't know is what are you looking for between these two. So the more accurately you can start defining what this relationship might be, the better it is in terms of the AI coming back with useful information. Otherwise, if you just ask it, if you just put blended learning and accessibility, it's going to just bring a huge amount of perhaps dissociated information, and you're only really going to get to the real nub of it when you've almost formulated it as a question. So when you're looking at, so let's take a better prompt. If you're thinking about, well, who is the person who's the agent of this? So if I say, how would a lecturer, because it could also be how could a learning designer, but how could a lecturer adjust? It could be adjust, adapt, create. We could think about a whole lot of different words there in terms of the actual verb. How could a lecturer adapt their blended learning course? Okay, so you're really kind of defining that a little bit. In, say, financial accounting, for students who struggle with accessibility issues such as, and then you may want to list the specific ones. So for example, if your interest is in dyslexia, or it's with physical disabilities, then the closer you can get, the more specific you can get, the more it's able to tailor. And that's what I think over the time have learned. And then if you look further down, usually most of the generative AIs have related questions at the bottom, and those sometimes can give you an additional prompt. But for me, it's almost like when you parse out a title of a thesis in the same way is, can you understand the key topic that is being looked at, and kind of from whose perspective, and what is the relationship between the entities, and are there contextual issues? So you could say for students suffering from dyslexia in South Africa, making sure that you've got ages, so for university students rather than just students, because otherwise it's going to bring in school level students as well. So I think the idea is to make it as specific as possible, and if there are caveats like don't include this or don't include that, that's also a useful addition to a prompt. So you're telling what you don't want as well. So I think the idea about modeling is probably what we'll need to do a lot of, modeling ourselves and then giving students opportunities to work together or in small groups initially to try and find better ways to get answers to specific things, so that they've got an opportunity almost to play and find out the extent. Because one of the challenges with these AIs is that when you first see the screen, you think, okay, it probably does this. And you looking at the sort of landscape and what's on the screen. But in fact, it takes quite a while for your poor brain to actually see all the functionalities. Some of them are captured on the left-hand side of the screen, and you can kind of see what it's prompting. Others have these three little dots where you can do more, and then you suddenly realize, oh my word, this does so much more than I thought. Or this AI is available in languages other than English, because at the moment, predominantly we're sitting with AIs that are English focused, but I mean, for example, Mistral AI, which comes from France, has actually started building a very robust one in other languages, and they're gradually using the learning across all the other AIs. I think what I didn't realize to some extent until I started working in it, or working with them, I should say, is that the AIs sometimes piggyback on each other. So some AIs incorporate Zotero, some of them, I think it was some Semantic Scholar, so that they kind of capitalizing on where other people have done things well. So I think understanding each screen as it appears initially, and just kind of find out what this one does and what that one does, is incredibly helpful. And maybe we can prompt our students to do like small group presentations looking at the same topic, and then using different AIs and demonstrating that back to each other about what they learned. Because the thing is, what we have today, I mean, ChatGPT is the newcomer in the market. We don't know if it will last. It's often the ones that come later that last, so we don't know. So we can't just use an AI. We've got to develop almost like an AI literacy, so that you can come in, look at a model and think, okay, these are the kinds of things I'm expecting from an AI. Where does this one do it? Or you might find it doesn't. So some of the research AIs, like the Ask Your PDF, are very specific. They only do a few things well. Others are getting broader and broader and broader, obviously because they're wanting people to kind of get into that ecosystem. But even then, I think we've got to help our students almost learn to navigate, because they are incredibly densely populated pages. I think we've probably got used to the sort of inquiry box at Google Scholar, or just Google in general as a search engine, and you've got this nice little box and you just pop in a question. Some of the AIs like ChatGPT have something similar. Claude has something similar. Perplexity has something similar. Those sort of general purpose AIs look a bit like a grown-up search engine. But the minute that you get onto the AIs that are particular for research, they're trying to have so many options available that it gets quite messy. And you will have to help students navigate where things are, because otherwise they're going to miss out on functions. Like this particular AI can actually prompt, not only proof. And we'll get the names for things, like you spoke about prompt engineering and hallucination. I mean, those are all new concepts that our students are going to need to learn. Some of them will have learned at school, others we're going to have to teach that explicitly. But I think in wrapping up with that question, I think the short answer is modeling and enabling students to model back to each other. So, and I'll talk about the formal standard of APA, but I also want to alert people that, in fact, I don't actually think that's enough, to be honest, because they don't give you the prompting question. And so I feel it's kind of letting the side down in a way, because it's the area that is the most interesting is the question that you ask the AI, not the fact that it's just perplexity, bracket 2024 bracket, close bracket, and then perplexity AI, which is the actual large language model, and then the URL to perplexity. I mean, that's the APA standard. I would like them to have that, but after the AI, to have the question that was posed on which day. That's what I would like, and that's what I've actually written in some of the work I've been doing. I write a footnote and go, the response from ChatGPT to, and then I write the actual question and on the date in which that was asked. And I'm doing it for myself so I can go back and figure out if I want to re-engineer that answer, or to some extent re-engineer it, because it'll never give you the same thing twice. That's the hard part. So I would get them to use a general purpose AI, like a ChatGPT, Meta, Gemini, Bing, and put in their potential question into all 4 of them, or 5 of them, or 6 of them, however many there are at that point. Maybe there are too many. And just have a good look at the kinds of answers that they give back, because it's almost like a little test of your idea. And then particularly to look for where, if it's a master's student, to obviously look for what theories people have used in the same area. So looking for the theories, and probably use more specific AI for research tools for that, because that's the big thing I think that master's students really struggle with, is when I'm looking at these concepts and the relationship between them, what kind of theories we use to explain what people found. And I think that would be something that would be very important. For the PhD work, I would be asking questions of the AI around where there are gaps. So, for example, where do we not know things about a particular topic? Because I think as much as AI can tell us what it does know, it also can tell us what it doesn't have answers to, which it does sometimes. It will say, I don't have sufficient data on this particular topic. And for a PhD student, that's a gift, because that means there is a gap in terms of their contribution to the corpus of knowledge. So I think it's a way of how you would use the tools for your different groups of students. Masters much more focusing on the theory side, PhD students seeing if you could find the gap in the first instance. And then what I would like to do is to do a better mapping for myself between the stages of the research journey, with kind of a few more sort of smaller subsections underneath those, and then trying to find tools that match. And even if it's tools overlap sometimes, that's fine, as long as you know you can try this one out. But it will never be completely stable, because obviously there's going to be a lot of change. But I think for lecturers to do that, to help their students in the first instance, I think would be a good start as a bit of a leg up into AI for research.